The Mississippi churned like a beast awakened, muddy waters swelling beyond their banks, branches and debris swept along in its relentless current. Mason Fletcher's shout was swallowed by the roar of the flood and the drumming rain as Duke, his German shepherd, broke free from his grip. The dog's powerful body launched from the slick riverbank, plunging into the raging torrent below. "Duke, no." Mason's voice cracked with desperation. 50 yards downstream, barely visible through the curtain of rain, a tiny spotted form struggled against the current, a fawn, its head barely above water, eyes wide with terror. Duke's muscular frame cut through the churning waters with determined strokes, even as the current dragged them both farther from shore. Mason scrambled along the muddy bank, heart hammering against his ribs, as man and dog locked eyes across the water. Something passed between them, a promise made long ago, in another lifetime. The river swallowed them both in the next instant, leaving only ripples where salvation and sacrifice had disappeared beneath the surface. No one could have predicted how this moment would shatter and remake them all. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching. From now, let's continue with the story. Mason Fletcher's cabin stood weathered but defiant on the wooded hillside overlooking the tributary of the Mississippi. Like its owner, it bore the scars of time and elements with stubborn dignity. At 45, Mason carried himself with the rigid posture of a man who'd spent 15 years in the military, though the slight limp from his right leg told of the price paid for that service. 8 years had passed since the disastrous flood rescue operation in Mosul that claimed his entire team. 8 years since he'd led 5 men into rising waters to evacuate a neighborhood, only to return alone with lungs full of filthy water and a soul drowning in guilt. The army gave him medals. His nightmares gave him no peace. Duke had been with him then, too, a military working dog trained for search and rescue. The German shepherd's graying muzzle was the only concession to the 7 years that had passed since they'd both retired to this quiet corner of Tennessee. Duke still maintained the alertness of his training, dark, intelligent eyes constantly scanning, ears pivoting to catch sounds beyond human perception. The scar running down his left flank was usually hidden by his thick fur, but Mason knew exactly where it was remembered the feel of warm blood on his hands as he'd carried Duke from the same floodwaters that took his men. Half a mile down the rugged dirt road lived Old Joe Thompson, 78 years of Tennessee mountain wisdom wrapped in faded denim and flannel. The former forest ranger had lost his wife to cancer 3 years back, and since then had appointed himself Mason's unwanted guardian. He appeared like clockwork every other day, usually bearing some extra food he'd accidentally made too much of, or needing help with some task that Mason suspected the spry old man could handle himself. "You can't outrun your ghosts by sitting still with them," Old Joe would say, his weathered face creasing with knowing lines. "Might as well make yourself useful while they keep you company." The late April rains had been relentless this season, turning the normally peaceful river treacherous. Mason watched the water levels with the wariness of someone who understood too well the destructive power hidden beneath a river's surface. Like memory, water could appear calm, while dangerous currents pulled unseen below. The rain started just before dawn, pattering against Mason's bedroom window like impatient fingers. He'd been awake already. The nightmares had seen to that. The familiar scene: rising water, desperate faces, reaching hands that slipped from his grasp, Duke's warm weight pressed against his side, the dog's steady breathing a counterpoint to Mason's racing heart. "Just rain," Mason muttered, running a hand over Duke's head. The shepherd whined softly, pressing closer. "Nothing more." Their morning routine proceeded as normal, despite the worsening weather. Mason brewed coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. Duke sat patiently by the door, awaiting his morning perimeter check. The ritual hadn't changed in 5 years. Regardless of weather or season, structure kept the chaos at bay. Mason opened the door, steam rising from his mug into the cool, damp air. The porch offered a sweeping view of the river below and the wildlife reserve beyond. Duke bounded down the steps, undeterred by the steady rain, while Mason settled into the handmade rocker that had been old Joe's housewarming gift. "What the hell?" Mason set his coffee down, squinting through the gray curtain of rain. Movement on the far side of the river caught his attention, not the natural movement of deer or other wildlife, but the deliberate progress of human figures. 2 men in camouflage, carrying rifles. Mason reached inside the door for his binoculars. Poachers. Had to be. Hunting season was months away, and no one had permission to hunt in the reserve anyway. Mason watched as they moved with practiced stealth along the tree line. Something about their confidence, their lack of concern about being spotted, raised the hairs on his neck. Duke returned to the porch, fur slick with rain, but instead of settling at Mason's feet, he stood rigid, ears forward, a low growl building in his chest. "You see 'em too, boy," Mason murmured. The dog's growl deepened. Mason had learned long ago to trust Duke's instincts. He went inside, returning with his rain jacket and an old army cap. The steady drizzle had intensified, drumming against the metal roof like distant artillery. "Come on," he said, clipping Duke's leash to his collar. "Let's see what they're up to." They descended the hill path toward the river, mud sucking at Mason's boots. The poachers had disappeared into the trees, but Duke pulled confidently in their direction, nose working the air despite the rain washing away scents. The river had risen overnight, creeping up the banks, turning the normally clear water to a churning brown. On the far bank, Mason found what he was looking for: boot prints in the mud, fresh shell casings winking dully in the wet earth. Duke sniffed intently, hackles raised. "Bastards," Mason muttered, picking up a casing. High-powered rifle, not the kind used for small game. They followed the muddy trail along the riverbank. Duke suddenly froze, ears alert. Mason heard it too, the crack of a rifle, too close for comfort. He pulled Duke behind a fallen oak as a second shot echoed through the trees. Peering cautiously around the log, Mason saw them. 2 men, one aiming across the river while the other scanned with binoculars. Between them, Mason caught a flash of movement. A doe, stumbling as she ran, a dark stain spreading across her tawny flank. "They shot her," Mason whispered, anger burning in his chest. The wounded doe disappeared into the underbrush. One poacher cursed loudly while the other laughed. They shouldered their rifles, apparently giving up the chase, and moved deeper into the reserve. Mason waited until they were out of sight before standing. "Come on, Duke. Nothing more we can do here." He turned to head back to the cabin, planning to call the game warden once he had cell service again. Duke, however, had other ideas. The shepherd whined, pulling against his leash toward the river. "What is it, boy?" Duke's whine became more insistent. Mason had learned to recognize the dog's signals during their service years. This wasn't fear or aggression, but the particular pitch that meant Duke had found someone. Then Mason heard it barely audible above the rush of the river and the patter of rain, a high, tremulous, bleating sound. Following Duke's lead, he made his way carefully along the slippery bank. The sound came again, desperate and weak. "There," Mason breathed. In the middle of the swollen river, a small island of rock and earth barely broke the surface. Trapped on this diminishing refuge was a fawn, its spotted coat slick with rain, spindly legs trembling as it tried to maintain footing on the eroding ground. Each time the fawn attempted to step into the water, the current pushed it back. "Must be the wounded doe's baby," Mason said, calculating distances and current speed with the automatic assessment of his training. The island was 30 yards from shore, in the middle of a rushing current strengthened by days of rain. The forecast called for more severe weather. Flash flood warnings had been issued. That island would be underwater within hours. Duke strained at the leash, whining urgently. The shepherd knew as well as Mason did what would happen to the fawn if left alone. "We need a boat," Mason said, looking upstream and down for any sign of a vessel. Nothing. The nearest boat landing was 5 miles away. The fawn bleated again, the sound weaker than before. Exhaustion or hypothermia would claim it before the waters did. "We need to get help," Mason told Duke, pulling out his phone. No signal, as he'd expected. The rain intensified, fat drops pelting the river's surface. Thunder rolled in the distance. The storm system that had been threatening all morning was almost upon them. Duke suddenly lunged forward with enough force to pull the leash from Mason's wet grasp. Before Mason could react, the shepherd had plunged into the churning water, powerful legs churning as he swam directly toward the stranded fawn. "Duke!" Mason shouted, panic rising in his throat. "Duke, come back!" But the dog was beyond recall, driven by instinct and training deeper than any command. Mason watched in horror as Duke's head bobbed in the current, gradually making progress toward the tiny island where life and death hung in precarious balance. "Duke!" Mason's voice tore through the rain as he ran alongside the riverbank, keeping pace with his dog's progress. The German shepherd's strong form cut through the churning water with determined strokes, but the current kept pushing him downstream, away from the small island where the fawn trembled. Mason's military training kicked in. Assess, plan, execute. The river bent sharply about 50 yards ahead. If Duke missed the island, the current would slam him into a tangle of downed trees caught in the bend. He needed to get ahead of them, ignoring the pain flaring in his bad leg. Mason sprinted through the underbrush, vaulting over fallen logs, sliding down muddy embankments. His boots squelched in the saturated ground as rain pelted his face. He'd spent years avoiding the water, and now everything he cared about was at its mercy. Duke had made progress, swimming at an angle against the current, but he was tiring. The German shepherd had reached middle age, and though still powerful, didn't have the stamina of his younger years. Mason could see his head dipping lower in the water between strokes. "Come on, boy," Mason urged under his breath. "You can make it." The fawn had noticed Duke's approach, backing to the highest point of the shrinking island. Ears flat against its head in fear, it had no way of knowing the dog was trying to help, not hunt. Mason reached the river bend and stopped, calculating distances and forces. Duke was 15 yards from the island now, but drifting faster. The shepherd's eyes locked with Mason's across the water, that same look from their service days. The one that said, "I'll complete the mission, no matter what." With a surge of effort, Duke corrected his course, powerful shoulders working against the current. Mason held his breath as the dog closed the distance to the island. 10 yards. 5. Then Duke's paws found purchase on the submerged edge of the island. He hauled himself up, shaking water from his coat as he cautiously approached the trembling fawn. "Easy, Duke," Mason called, though he knew the dog couldn't hear him over the rush of water and rain. The fawn backed away, bleating weakly, but had nowhere to go. Duke stopped, lowering his head and body in the submissive posture Mason had taught him for approaching trauma victims. Slowly, the German shepherd inched forward on his belly until he was beside the fawn. With surprising gentleness, Duke nosed the small creature, then looked back at Mason across the water. Mission accomplished. But now they were both stranded. The island was disappearing inch by inch as the river rose. Mason scanned the banks for anything he could use: a boat, a rope, a fallen tree. Nothing. He'd have to go in after them. "Hold position, Duke," he shouted, using the command voice that had carried across battlefields. Duke responded by lying down next to the fawn, his body providing warmth and shelter from the rain. The shepherd wouldn't leave without orders. Even as water began lapping at his paws, Mason moved downstream to a narrower section of the river. The current would be stronger here, but the distance shorter. He stripped off his rain jacket and boots, secured his knife to his belt, and waded in. The cold hit him like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs. The peaceful river he'd watched for years had transformed into a monster, tugging at his legs with surprising strength. Mason pushed forward, using the smooth river stones as anchors for his feet. When the water reached his chest, he pushed off, swimming with the current at an angle toward the island. The river had other plans. A submerged branch caught his leg, twisting him underwater. Pain exploded in his calf as bark tore through flesh. Mason surfaced, gasping, but the damage was done. Blood clouded the water around his leg, and the current had pushed him well past the island. He fought to reach the far bank, every stroke an exercise in determination over pain. When his feet finally found the bottom, he dragged himself onto the muddy shore, chest heaving. Blood pulsed from the gash in his calf, a 6-inch tear that would need stitches. But there was no time for that now. From his new position, Mason could see the island clearly, and the water now covering half its surface. Duke stood guard over the fawn, which had pressed against the dog's side in fear or acceptance of protection. Mason scanned the bank and spotted what he needed: a fallen birch tree, its trunk stretching almost halfway across the river. With renewed purpose, he limped to the tree and began breaking off branches, ignoring the pain shooting up his leg with each movement. "Hold on, Duke," he muttered. Just a little longer. Using his knife and brute strength, Mason freed the trunk from its remaining roots. The birch was light for its size, waterlogged but manageable. He dragged it downstream to position it above the island, then waded in, pushing the makeshift bridge ahead of him. The water rose to his waist, threatening to lift the log out of his control. Mason gritted his teeth against the pain in his leg and pushed harder. The current caught the tree, spinning it toward the island faster than he intended. It crashed against the remnants of solid ground, startling the fawn. which skittered back dangerously close to the water's edge. "Duke, secure!" Mason commanded, using the rescue instruction that meant to hold a victim in place. The German shepherd immediately moved to block the fawn's retreat, gently herding it toward the fallen tree. Mason pulled himself onto the log, straddling it like a balance beam as he inched toward the island. Water sprayed over him as the current battered the improvised bridge. When he reached the island, Mason found it was barely 2 feet wide now. Duke stood soaking wet, but alert, his body curved protectively around the shivering fawn. "Good boy," Mason said, his voice thick with emotion. "Best damn dog in Tennessee." The fawn's large eyes regarded him with terror and exhaustion. Up close, Mason could see it was very young, probably only a few weeks old, its coat still dotted with white spots. A graze wound marked its hind leg, likely caught by the same bullet that had struck its mother. "All right, let's get you both out of here." Mason knelt carefully in the mud and lifted the fawn. It weighed almost nothing, all spindly legs and rapid heartbeat. To his surprise, it didn't struggle, perhaps too exhausted to fight. "Duke, cross," he commanded, pointing to the log. The German shepherd obeyed instantly, padding carefully onto the makeshift bridge. His claws dug into the soft wood for traction as he made his way toward the shore. Mason followed, cradling the fawn against his chest with one arm while using the other for balance. Halfway across, the log shifted, dipping dangerously beneath their combined weight. Mason froze, heart hammering. Duke looked back, sensing the danger. "Keep going," Mason urged, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. One careful step at a time, they crossed the churning water. When Duke reached the bank, Mason handed him the fawn with the carry command they'd practiced countless times with rescue dummies. The shepherd took the small deer by the scruff with gentle precision, then scrambled up the muddy slope to safety. Mason followed, his injured leg screaming in protest. As he reached solid ground, the log bridge finally surrendered to the current, tumbling away downstream. The timing couldn't have been closer. He collapsed on the wet earth beside Duke, who had set the fawn down on a patch of grass beneath a sheltering pine. The rain continued to pour, but they had made it, all three of them, against the odds. "Let's get home," Mason said, lifting the now docile fawn. "We've got work to do." The journey back to the cabin was arduous. Mason's injured leg threatened to buckle with each step, leaving a trail of blood-tinged rainwater behind him. The fawn lay limp in his arms, its breath coming in shallow pants, while Duke led the way, constantly looking back to ensure his humans, both old and new, were following. By the time they reached the cabin, the storm had intensified. Wind whipped through the trees, bringing down small branches and a torrent of pine needles. Mason shouldered open the door, Duke slipping in ahead of him. "Kitchen table," Mason muttered, laying the fawn on the wooden surface that had seen its share of field dressing, though never for healing purposes. Duke shook himself vigorously, spraying water across the worn plank floor before taking up position beside the table, eyes fixed on the trembling deer. Mason limped to the bathroom, returning with his field medical kit, one of the few relics of his military days he'd found practical to keep. Under the bright kitchen light, the fawn's condition was clearer. Its coat was matted with river mud, the white spots barely visible beneath the grime. The wound on its hind leg wasn't deep, but the edges were red and irritated. Mason cleaned it carefully, surprised at how still the creature remained. Only its rapid breathing and the occasional flick of an ear betrayed its consciousness. "Bullet graze," Mason confirmed, examining the wound. "Same caliber that got your mama. I'd wager." He applied antiseptic and a light bandage, then checked the fawn for other injuries. Finding none, he fashioned a makeshift bed from an old blanket in a plastic storage tub, lining it with a heating pad set on low. "This'll have to do for now," he told Duke, who watched the proceedings with intense focus. "I need to call someone." Mason reached for his cell phone, grimacing at the lack of service bars. The landline proved equally useless. The storm had likely taken down a line somewhere. They were on their own, at least until the weather cleared. His own injury demanded attention. Mason rolled up his torn pant leg, revealing a jagged 6-inch gash. He cleaned and bandaged it with practiced efficiency, downing 2 antibiotic tablets with a swig of whiskey. Field medicine at its finest. A heavy knock at the door startled all 3 of them. The fawn attempted to stand in its makeshift bed, eyes wide with panic, while Duke moved protectively in front of it, a low growl building in his throat. "Mason, you in there? Son," old Joe's gravelly voice carried through the door. Mason limped across the room and opened the door to find Joe Thompson dripping on his porch, a plastic rain poncho doing little to keep the old man dry. "Was checking the creek level when I saw your blood trail," Joe said without preamble, eyes drifting to Mason's bandaged leg. "What kind of trouble you gotten yourself into now?" Mason stepped aside to let the older man in. Joe's eyebrows shot up when he spotted the fawn and Duke's protective stance. "Well, I'll be damned," he said softly. "That's not your typical house guest." Mason explained the morning's events while Joe examined the fawn with gentle, knowing hands. The former forest ranger had spent decades tending to wildlife before retirement, and his expertise showed in his careful movements. "Poachers? You say?" Joe's weathered face hardened, getting bolder every season. Used to be they'd stick to the back country. Now they're operating right under our noses. He stroked the fawn's head with one gnarled finger. "She's dehydrated. Got any goat's milk?" "Just regular," Mason replied. "It'll do in a pinch. Mix it with a little sugar water. We need to get some fluids in her." Mason prepared the mixture while Joe continued his examination. Duke hadn't moved from his post, though his growling ceased once he recognized Joe as a friend. "That's a good dog you got there," Joe observed. "Not many would risk themselves for a creature they're instinctually wired to chase." "Duke's special," Mason said simply. They worked together to feed the fawn using a turkey baster, the closest thing to a bottle Mason had. The small deer resisted at first, then began to suckle eagerly, emptying the makeshift bottle in seconds. "She's a fighter," Joe noted with approval. "What are you calling her?" Mason hadn't thought about naming the fawn. Names meant attachment, and attachment meant eventual loss. But looking at Duke's watchful eyes and the fawn's determination to live, he found himself saying, "Hope. Her name is Hope." Joe nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Hope it is." The old ranger helped Mason establish a proper care routine, showing him how to stimulate the fawn to urinate and defecate as a mother deer would. They created a more suitable bed, moving Hope to a corner of the living room near the fireplace where Duke could keep watch. "Wildlife folks won't be able to get here until the road's clear," Joe said, looking out at the worsening storm. And even then, their rehab center is at capacity after that tornado hit the eastern preserves last month. I'll manage, Mason replied, more confidently than he felt. Joe fixed him with a knowing look. Might be good for you both. You and that dog have been carrying something heavy for a long time. Sometimes the best way to put down one burden is to pick up another. Before Mason could respond, a crash of thunder shook the cabin, causing Hope to cry out in fear. Duke immediately moved closer, resting his head on the edge of the tub where the fawn lay. To Mason's amazement, the small deer calmed at the dog's presence. "I'd best get back before the creek rises any higher," Joe said, pulling his poncho back on. "I'll check on you tomorrow, weather permitting. Call me on the CB if you need anything. Those old radios work when nothing else does." After Joe left, Mason settled into his armchair, leg propped up on an ottoman. The pain had subsided to a dull throb, manageable with over-the-counter medication. Duke remained beside Hope, who had finally fallen asleep, her sides rising and falling in a more regular rhythm. "You did good today," Mason told the shepherd. "Real good." Outside, the storm raged on. Rain lashed against the windows while wind howled through the pine trees surrounding the cabin. The sound triggered something in Mason memories of another storm, another flood. His breathing quickened, hands gripping the armrests as the room seemed to shift around him. He was back in Mosul, water rising around military vehicles, his team struggling to evacuate civilians from rapidly flooding streets. The radio crackled with desperate calls for assistance. Staff Sergeant Williams' voice, usually so steady, pitched high with panic. "We're trapped. The wall collapsed. Water's coming in too fast." Mason reached for them, but the current pulled them away, one by one. A cold nose pressed against his hand, jerking him back to the present. Duke stood beside his chair, amber eyes filled with concern. The dog whined softly, then placed his head on Mason's lap, a grounding technique they'd developed over years of shared nightmares. "I'm here," Mason said, his voice hoarse. "I'm here, boy." The remainder of the day passed in 3-hour cycles of feeding, cleaning, and monitoring Hope. Mason found purpose in the rigid schedule, his training responding to the clear mission parameters, keep the fawn alive until help arrived. Duke seemed equally invested, alerting Mason when Hope stirred and standing guard during the brief periods when Mason dozed. As evening fell, Mason's phone finally showed a single bar of service. He called the wildlife authorities, only to confirm what Joe had already told him. They were overwhelmed with emergency calls due to the storm and understaffed due to budget cuts. The earliest they could send someone would be 3 or 4 days, assuming the roads cleared. "Just keep it warm, hydrated, and minimize human contact," the ranger advised. "We don't want it imprinting if it's going to be released eventually." Mason looked at Duke, who hadn't left Hope's side except to go outside for necessary breaks. "I think that ship might have sailed," he muttered after hanging up. That night, Mason dragged his mattress into the living room, unwilling to leave his patients alone. His leg throbbed with infection threat, and he doubled his antibiotic dose, knowing he couldn't afford to become incapacitated. As he drifted into uneasy sleep, the last thing he saw was Duke curled around Hope's tub, the shepherd's body rising and falling with each breath, matching the rhythm of the fawn's. Morning brought a brief respite from the rain, though the sky remained ominously dark. Mason checked Hope's wound, relieved to find no signs of infection. The fawn was more alert, watching him with enormous liquid eyes as he changed her bedding and prepared another bottle. "You're looking better," he told her, surprised at the gentleness in his own voice. It had been years since he'd spoken to anyone that way. Duke paced anxiously by the door, signaling his need to go out. Mason led him onto the porch, watching as the shepherd surveyed the flooded yard before quickly taking care of business and returning inside, shaking off minimal moisture. "Storm's not done with us," Mason observed, noting the fresh bands of rain visible across the valley. He used the break in weather to gather more firewood from the covered stack on the porch and check his generator's fuel level. The power had flickered several times overnight but hadn't failed completely. It was only a matter of time, though these mountain storms could knock out electricity for days, while Hope napped under Duke's watchful eye. Mason tuned his battery-powered radio to the weather band. The news wasn't good. The storm system had stalled over eastern Tennessee, dumping record rainfall. Flash flood warnings had been extended, and several nearby communities were being evacuated. Mason's cabin sat high enough to avoid flooding, but the access road would likely be underwater soon, cutting him off completely. He inventoried his supplies, enough food and medicine for a week, maybe longer if he was careful. Duke's food would last about the same. For Hope, he'd need to get creative once the milk ran out. A memory surfaced, one of the few positive ones from his childhood. His grandfather showing him how to make a mash for an orphaned fawn using oats, finely ground nuts, and strained vegetable water. Mason had forgotten it until now, buried beneath years of more urgent survival knowledge. The brief window of clear weather allowed Mason to check the property. He limped down to the edge of his land where he could see the valley below. What he found confirmed his fears. The main road was underwater in several places, and the river had breached its banks, spreading across the lower fields. In the distance, near the wildlife preserve, Mason spotted movement. Using his binoculars, he focused on a small encampment partially hidden among the trees too well established to belong to casual hunters. "Poaching operation," he muttered to himself, noting the various vehicles and equipment. From this distance, he could make out at least 4 men moving around the camp. The wounded doe was likely long gone, but these men were still hunting something, or someone. A twinge of unease sent Mason back to the cabin quicker than his injured leg appreciated. He secured the doors and windows, then retrieved his shotgun from the locked cabinet, loading it and placing it within easy reach. Duke raised his head at the familiar sound of the pump action, but didn't leave Hope's side. By mid-afternoon, the rain returned with a vengeance. Water seeped under the back door despite Mason's efforts with towels and sandbags kept for this purpose. Duke grew increasingly agitated, pacing between Hope and the rising water. "We need higher ground," Mason decided. Looking around the single-story cabin, the loft above the living room was the obvious choice, accessible by ladder and the highest point in the structure. Mason carefully lifted Hope's makeshift bed, the fawn now alert enough to stand on wobbling legs within the confines of the tub. Duke led the way, climbing the ladder with practiced ease, a skill learned during their service days when vertical evacuations were sometimes necessary. Mason secured the tub in the loft, creating a dry, warm nest among stored blankets and emergency supplies. Duke immediately settled beside it, his posture making it clear he had no intention of coming down. "Good call," Mason told him. "Keep her safe." As darkness fell, the storm intensified to a fury Mason hadn't witnessed since his deployment. Wind screamed around the cabin's eaves while rain hammered against the roof like machine gun fire. The electricity finally surrendered at 8 p.m., plunging the cabin into darkness, relieved only by the fireplace's glow and Mason's battery lanterns. He was heating water for another bottle when headlights swept across the front windows. Mason extinguished the lantern and moved to the window, peering cautiously around the edge of the curtain. A mud-splattered pickup had pulled into his drive, its high clearance allowing it to navigate the flooded access road. Two men sat inside, talking animatedly. Mason's instincts flared. No one would be out in this weather without urgent purpose, and neighbors would have announced themselves by radio before coming over. He reached for the shotgun, positioning himself where he could see the door while remaining hidden. The truck's doors opened, and two men emerged, hurrying through the downpour toward the porch. They wore rain gear over camouflage clothing, the same men Mason had spotted earlier by the river. One carried a rifle slung across his back, partially hidden by his rain poncho. The shorter man pounded on the door. "Hello? Anybody home? We need help. Our camp got flooded out." Mason remained silent, signaling to Duke to stay quiet. The shepherd, sensing the tension, hadn't made a sound from his position in the loft. "I know someone's here," the man called. "Saw the smoke from your chimney. We just need shelter till morning." It could be innocent stranded hunters seeking refuge from the storm, but Mason's years of reading threat assessments told him otherwise. These men had been poaching in a wildlife preserve, had shot Hope's mother, and now, coincidentally, were at his door. The timing was too convenient. The taller man nudged his companion, pointing to the side of the cabin where Mason's and Duke's tracks led to and from the river, partially washed away, but still visible to trained eyes. They spoke in hushed tones. Then the shorter man tried the door handle, finding it locked. "We know you found something that belongs to us," he called, his friendly tone hardening. "We tracked it here. Make this easy on yourself." Mason's suspicions crystallized into certainty. Somehow, they knew about Hope. Perhaps they'd seen the rescue, or found signs of it afterward. Either way, they weren't leaving empty-handed. Above, Duke growled softly, the sound barely audible over the storm. Hope must have sensed the tension. A soft bleating drifted down from the loft, instantly silencing Duke's growl as the shepherd shifted to comfort the fawn. The men outside exchanged looks. "Hear that?" the taller one said. "That's proof right there." They moved off the porch, circling the cabin, looking for another way in. Mason knew his home well enough to predict their next move, the back door, where the rising water had already compromised his defenses. He moved silently through the darkened cabin, positioning himself where he could cover both entrances. The radio on the kitchen counter crackled to life, making Mason jump. Old Joe's voice came through the static. "Mason, you there? River's rising fast. You might want to move to higher ground. I'm heading your way with the truck." The men outside froze at the sound, then hurried back to their vehicle. Mason watched through the window as they reversed out of his drive and disappeared down the flooded road, headlights cutting through the rain and darkness. They would be back. Mason knew. And next time, They wouldn't knock. The night passed in fitful vigils. Mason dozed in his chair, shotgun across his lap, waking at every crack of thunder and groan of timber. Duke remained in the loft with Hope, the shepherd's acute hearing compensating for Mason's hypervigilant but human limitations. By dawn, the rain had slowed to a steady drizzle, though the skies remained leaden with the promise of more to come. Mason's leg had worsened overnight, the skin around the wound hot and tight. He swallowed more antibiotics with lukewarm coffee, grimacing at both the taste and the knowledge that infection was taking hold despite his precautions. Field medicine could only accomplish so much. "Mason, you alive in there?" Old Joe's voice, followed by 3 sharp knocks, startled Mason from his pain assessment. After verifying it was indeed his neighbor through the window, Mason unbolted the door. Joe Thompson stood on the porch in waders and a rain slicker, looking remarkably spry for a man pushing 80 who'd just navigated a flood zone. "Thought you might need checking on," Joe said, stepping inside and giving Mason's bandaged leg a critical once-over. "Looks like I was right. Had some unwelcome visitors last night," Mason replied, relocking the door behind Joe. "Poachers, I think. They were looking for something specific." Joe nodded toward the loft. "The little one up there, I reckon." "Why would they care about an orphaned fawn?" Mason asked, leading Joe to the kitchen where he could elevate his throbbing leg. "Might not be the fawn they want," Joe said, helping himself to coffee. "Might be what the fawn represents." At Mason's questioning look, Joe continued, "You said you saw their camp near the preserve. That land's been contested for years. Developer named Harlan Blackwood's been trying to build a resort there, luxury cabins, golf course, the works. County keeps denying permits because of the wildlife habitat. What's that got to do with poachers, if there's no wildlife to protect?" Joe let the implication hang in the air. Mason's military mind connected the dots instantly. They're clearing the preserve, killing or driving out the protected species so the land loses its conservation status. That'd be my guess. Your wounded doe and her fawn would be evidence of that. Evidence that could delay or stop the development if wildlife authorities got involved. A soft bleating from above drew their attention. Duke's head appeared at the edge of the loft, followed by Hope's, as the fawn attempted to peer over the edge. In just 24 hours, the deer had grown noticeably stronger, though still unsteady on her slender legs. "She's looking better," Joe observed, rising to check on the pair. Mason followed more slowly, his injured leg protesting each step up the ladder. Hope no longer shied away from human touch, allowing Joe to check her wound and temperature with a calm that belied her wild nature. "She's stabilizing," the old ranger confirmed. "Fever's gone. Another day or two, and she might be strong enough to release. If we can find her mama." "If her mother's still alive," Mason said grimly. "Deer are tougher than they look," Joe replied. "I've tracked wounded as that survived worse than a bullet graze. If she's alive, she'll be looking for her fawn." A distant rumble of engines cut through the patter of rain on the roof. Mason moved to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains. 3 vehicles were making their way up the muddy access road, the pickup from last night, followed by an ATV and a larger SUV. "Company," Mason said tersely. "The unwelcome kind." Joe joined him at the window, his weathered face hardening at the sight. That's Harlan Blackwood's rig in front, the big SUV. The developer and head poacher. I'd wager. Mason assessed their options with practiced efficiency. The cabin had 2 exits, front and back, both visible to the approaching vehicles. The woods offered cover, but would be difficult to navigate with his injured leg. A dog and a fawn. Fighting wasn't viable. They were outnumbered and outgunned. We need to hide Hope, Mason decided. Buy time until the authorities can get here. No cell service, Joe reminded him. And they've likely cut the landlines. Standard procedure for these types. Mason's gaze fell on the radio. CB might still reach the ranger station if the repeater on Miller's Ridge is working. While Joe attempted to make contact, Mason quickly gathered essentials into a backpack: first aid supplies, water, jerky, and a space blanket. He added his sidearm and ammunition as a last resort. Duke watched from the loft, sensing the urgency, but unwilling to leave Hope's side. "Anything?" Mason asked as engines grew louder. Joe shook his head, still adjusting the radio's frequency. "Static. Storm's interfering." The vehicles pulled up outside, doors slamming as men disembarked. Mason counted 5 distinct voices through the walls, a larger force than he'd anticipated. Heavy footsteps mounted the porch, followed by a pounding on the door. "Fletcher, we know you're in there." A deep voice, authoritative and impatient. "This doesn't have to get complicated." Joe abandoned the radio, moving to stand beside Mason. The old ranger's eyes burned with a fierce light that belied his years. "Root cellar," he whispered. "Under the pantry floor. It's not much, but it might buy us time." Mason had forgotten about the small storage space beneath the kitchen, a common feature in older mountain cabins, used to preserve food before refrigeration became commonplace. He quickly moved to the pantry, pulling aside the braided rug to reveal a trapdoor. "Duke, come," he commanded, keeping his voice low. The shepherd hesitated, looking between Mason and Hope. The fawn had pressed herself into the corner of her tub, ears flattened in fear. "Bring her," Mason clarified, making a carrying motion. Duke immediately nudged his nose under the fawn, supporting her weight as she unsteadily rose to her feet. With remarkable gentleness, the shepherd guided Hope toward the ladder, positioning himself so she could lean against his solid frame. Mason watched in amazement as Duke coached the fawn down the steep steps, one tentative hoof at a time. The bond between them had deepened beyond protection into something like parental guidance. Outside, the pounding on the door grew more insistent. "Last chance. Fletcher, open up or we're coming in." Joe had opened the trap door, revealing a small earthen space barely large enough for a man to stand in. Mason quickly laid the space blanket on the dirt floor, creating a dry spot for Hope. Duke needed no command to follow the fawn down, positioning himself protectively beside her. "Stay," Mason told them both, his voice thick with emotion. "Silent." Duke's intelligent eyes held his for a moment, a promise passing between them, before Mason closed the trapdoor and replaced the rug. He had just straightened up when the front door burst open, wood splintering around the lock. 4 men entered, 3 with rifles raised, the 4th hanging back, clearly the leader. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with silver hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to giving orders rather than taking them. "Mr. Fletcher," he said, his voice matching the one that had called through the door. "And Joe Thompson, this is an unexpected bonus." "Harlan," Joe acknowledged coldly. Still playing developer by day, poacher by night. Blackwood smiled without warmth. I prefer to think of it as wildlife management. Speaking of which, we tracked an injured deer to this property yesterday. My men believe you may have found something that belongs to us. This is private property, Mason said evenly. And you're trespassing. Technically correct, Blackwood conceded. But these are extraordinary circumstances. The flood has created an emergency situation, and as a concerned citizen, I'm simply checking on my neighbors. His smile thinned. Now, where is it? Where's what? Mason asked, shifting his weight to keep his injured leg from buckling. One of the armed men stepped forward. We tracked blood from the river, deer blood, and we heard it last night. I treat wounded animals sometimes. Joe interjected. Part of being a former ranger, but that doesn't give you the right to break down doors. Search the place, Blackwood ordered. Carefully. I want it alive. Two men moved through the cabin, checking rooms and closets. Mason tensed when one approached the pantry but forced himself to remain impassive. The man glanced inside but didn't notice the rug hiding the trap door. Nothing downstairs, he reported. Check up there, Blackwood directed, pointing to the loft. The third gunman climbed the ladder, boots heavy on the wooden rungs. Mason heard him moving around above, disturbing the blankets where Duke and Hope had rested hours earlier. Signs they were here, the man called down. Fur and some droppings, but they're gone now. Blackwood's expression darkened. Where is it, Fletcher? I don't know what you're talking about, Mason replied, meeting the man's gaze steadily. Let me be perfectly clear, Blackwood said, stepping closer. That fawn is evidence of illegal hunting, which could delay my development project by months or years. Now, I've invested too much to let a bleeding heart veteran and a washed-up ranger interfere with progress. Illegal hunting, Joe scoffed. That's rich, coming from you. Prove it, Blackwood challenged. Wildlife officers might be interested in poaching, but they're more interested in who's signing their paychecks these days. Budget cuts have made them quite receptive to private donations. The implication was clear. Blackwood had influence with the authorities. Even if Mason and Joe managed to contact them, there was no guarantee of help. Last chance, Blackwood said. Where's the fawn? The silence stretched between them, broken only by the persistent drumming of rain on the roof. Finally, Mason spoke. It died during the night. I buried it at the edge of the property. Blackwood studied him, searching for deception. Show me. In this weather. Mason gestured to the window where rain had begun falling in sheets again. Wait until it clears. Now, Blackwood insisted, or my men start taking this cabin apart board by board. Mason knew the threat wasn't empty. He glanced at Joe, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. They needed to get these men away from the cabin, away from the root cellar where Duke and Hope were hidden. Fine, Mason conceded. It's about 50 yards behind the cabin, near the big oak. Taylor. Richards go with them, Blackwood ordered. Johnson, stay here and keep looking. That burial story smells worse than week-old bait. Mason grabbed his rain jacket, mentally calculating how long they could keep up the charade. The grave would obviously be empty, but perhaps they could use the worsening weather to create a diversion. His leg throbbed with each step as they moved onto the porch. the infection sapping his strength. Joe took the lead, moving with the confidence of someone who knew these woods as well as his own reflection. The rain hammered down, reducing visibility to mere yards and turning the ground into treacherous mud. Mason followed, aware of the two armed men close behind them. "Storm's picking up again," Joe called over his shoulder, his voice nearly lost in a crack of thunder. "Flash flood warning still in effect." As if confirming his words, a distant roaring became audible beneath the drumming rain, the sound of water moving with destructive force. Mason recognized it instantly, his combat instincts flaring to life. Upstream, a debris dam must have broken, releasing a wall of water toward the valley. "We need to get to higher ground," he shouted. "Now." Taylor, the shorter gunman, laughed. "Nice try. Keep moving." But Richards had heard it too, his face paling as the roar intensified. "He's right," he said, grabbing his companion's arm. "That's a flash flood coming." Before anyone could react, the world dissolved into chaos. A wall of water, 6 feet high and carrying trees and debris like battering rams, crashed through the trees to their right. The men scattered, all thoughts of fawns and evidence forgotten in the face of imminent danger. "The ridge!" Joe shouted, pointing toward a rocky outcropping 20 yards uphill. Mason lunged forward, ignoring the fire in his leg as he half-dragged Joe toward safety. Behind them, Taylor slipped in the mud, disappearing beneath the churning water with a strangled cry. Richards made it halfway up the slope before a floating log slammed into him, carrying him away in the torrent. They reached the ridge seconds before the water, scrambling onto the relative safety of the stone outcropping. Mason turned back toward the cabin, his heart seizing at the sight. The flood had split around the small hill where his home stood, but water lapped at the foundation, rising quickly. Duke and Hope were trapped in a root cellar that would soon be underwater. "Duke!" Mason's shout was lost in the roar of floodwaters. His cabin stood like an island in the rising torrent, water now lapping at the porch steps. Johnson and Blackwood had retreated to the roof of the SUV, their faces pale with shock as they watched the flash flood transform the landscape. "We have to get back there," Mason told Joe, his voice tight with desperation. "The cellar will flood first." Joe gripped Mason's arm, his weathered hand surprisingly strong. "You'll never make it across that current, not with that leg." Mason shook him off, mind racing through tactical options. The direct route was impossible, 30 yards of churning water carrying debris that could kill a man with a single impact. But upstream, where the flood narrowed between 2 rocky outcroppings. "There," he pointed, "the channel's narrower. I can use that fallen pine as a bridge." "You're out of your mind," Joe protested, but Mason was already moving, traversing the ridge toward the natural choke point. The fallen pine stretched across the narrowest part of the flood, its trunk partially submerged but still offering a precarious path. Mason didn't hesitate. He lowered himself onto the log, using his arms to stabilize his body as he inched across, ignoring the searing pain in his injured leg. Halfway across, the log shifted, nearly sending Mason into the raging water below. He froze, waiting for the trunk to settle before continuing his painstaking progress. Behind him, Joe had followed to the edge, but could only watch, his face a mask of concern. When Mason finally reached the other side, he collapsed momentarily on solid ground, chest heaving. The cabin was still 50 yards away, and time was running out. He pushed himself to his feet, limping as fast as his injured leg would allow. Blackwood spotted him approaching and shouted something to Johnson, who scrambled from the SUV's roof to the driver's side. The engine roared to life, the vehicle lurching forward through the shallower water toward Mason. "Stop right there. Fletcher," Blackwood called, now wielding a handgun. "This has gone far enough." Mason ignored the command, angling away from the SUV toward the back of the cabin where the water was shallower. Johnson gunned the engine, the vehicle fishtailing in the mud as it cut Mason off. "The fawn isn't worth dying for," Blackwood said, leveling the gun at Mason's chest. "Walk away now, and we all forget this happened." "There's a dog down there, too," Mason replied, his voice deadly calm. "And neither of them is going to drown because of your greed." Johnson emerged from the SUV, rifle in hand. "Boss, we need to get out of here. The road's going to be completely washed out soon." "Not without handling this," Blackwood insisted, gesturing toward Mason with his gun. "He's a witness." "They both are." The implication was clear. Mason tensed, calculating the distance to the nearest cover. Too far, especially with his bad leg. He needed a diversion, as if in answer to his unspoken prayer. Old Joe appeared on the cabin's porch, pump shotgun in hand. "Drop it, Harlan," the old ranger shouted, "or I'll drop you where you stand." Blackwood's attention wavered for a crucial second. Mason seized the opportunity, diving behind the woodpile as Johnson's rifle cracked. Splinters flew as the bullet impacted the logs inches from Mason's head. "Joe, get down," Mason yelled, but the warning came too late. Blackwood fired twice. The first shot missed, splintering the doorframe beside Joe. The second caught the old ranger in the shoulder, spinning him around. Joe staggered but remained upright, returning fire with his shotgun. The blast went wide, but it was enough to send Blackwood and Johnson scrambling for cover behind the SUV. Mason used the distraction to reach the cabin's back door, which stood partially submerged. He waded through knee-deep water into the kitchen, where the flood had already covered the floor in several inches of muddy water. "Joe," Mason called, finding the old man leaning heavily against the doorframe, blood seeping between the fingers clutched to his shoulder. "I'm all right," Joe grimaced. "Just winged me." "Get to the cellar." Mason helped Joe to a chair before rushing to the pantry. Water was already seeping through the trapdoor. He flung aside the rug and wrenched open the heavy wooden door, revealing pitch darkness below. "Duke," he called, heart pounding. A splash and a desperate whine answered him. As his eyes adjusted, Mason could make out Duke standing on his hind legs, front paws braced against the cellar wall. The water had already risen to the shepherd's chest. Balanced precariously on Duke's back was Hope, the fawn, trembling but alive, her slender legs splayed to maintain balance on her living raft. "Good boy," Mason breathed, reaching down to first lift Hope to safety. The fawn was soaking wet but uninjured, bleeding softly as Mason set her on the relatively dry kitchen floor. Duke was harder to extract. The shepherd was exhausted from supporting Hope, his powerful legs shaking with fatigue. Mason leaned dangerously far into the flooded cellar, grabbing Duke's collar and hauling with all his strength. The dog scrambled for purchase on the slick earthen walls, finally gaining enough traction to leap upward as Mason pulled. They collapsed together on the kitchen floor, Duke immediately shaking water from his coat before checking on Hope with a gentle nudge of his nose. The fawn pressed against the shepherd's side, seeking the comfort of her unlikely protector. "They're coming," Joe warned from his position near the window. "And they don't look like they're in a talking mood." Mason peered outside. Blackwood and Johnson were advancing toward the cabin, using the SUV as moving cover as they pushed it slowly through the floodwater. With the vehicle as a shield, Joe's shotgun would be useless. "We need to move," Mason decided. Upper floor of the shed might still be above water. The shed stood 20 yards behind the cabin. A sturdy two-story structure Mason used for storage and occasional woodworking. Its elevated position on a slight rise gave it better protection from the flood than the cabin itself. "Can you make it?" Mason asked Joe, eyeing the old man's bleeding shoulder. "Been shot worse than this breaking up bar fights in my ranger days," Joe replied with grim humor. "Just don't expect me to sprint." Mason gathered hope in his arms while Duke pressed close to Joe, seeming to understand the old man needed support. They slipped out the back door just as Blackwood and Johnson reached the front porch. The water had risen further, now waist-deep in places. Mason led the way, testing each step before committing his weight. Mindful of hidden obstacles and sinkholes, hope trembled in his arms but remained silent, as if sensing the need for stealth. They had almost reached the shed when Johnson spotted them. "There!" he shouted, raising his rifle. Mason lunged forward, sheltering Hope with his body as he crashed through the shed door. Joe and Duke followed seconds later, the old ranger slamming the door behind them just as bullets splintered the wood. "Upstairs," Mason directed, already moving toward the ladder that led to the shed's second level. He passed Hope to Joe, who cradled the fawn awkwardly with his good arm while Mason helped him climb. Duke followed without command, the shepherd's training making him adept at scaling even steep ladders. The upper level was dry but offered little in the way of defense: a wooden floor, some storage shelves, and a small window that overlooked the property. Through it, Mason could see Blackwood and Johnson advancing, using floating debris as stepping stones to navigate the deepest parts of the flood. "Any ideas?" Joe asked, settling Hope on a pile of clean tarps. Mason checked his sidearm, a 9mm with one full magazine. Against rifles, at this distance, the odds weren't good. His gaze fell on the collection of woodworking tools hanging on the wall. Among them was a flare gun, used for signaling during hunting trips. "Maybe one," he said, checking to see if the flare was still loaded. It was outside. Blackwood's voice carried over the sound of rushing water. "Fletcher Thompson, this ends now. Send out the fawn, and we might let you live." Mason moved to the window, calculating angles and distances. Johnson was closer, wading through chest-deep water near the shed's eastern side. Blackwood hung back, directing from what he perceived as a safe distance. "When I fire, be ready to move," Mason told Joe. "We'll only get one chance." Joe nodded, his face pale from blood loss but his eyes still sharp. Duke positioned himself beside Hope, body tense and ready. Mason waited until Johnson was directly below the window, then flung it open and fired the flare. The red projectile streaked downward, striking the water near Johnson with a hiss of steam. The man recoiled in surprise, losing his footing in the current. As he flailed, Mason leaned out and fired 2 precise shots from his handgun. The first missed, but the second struck Johnson's rifle, knocking it from his hands. The weapon disappeared beneath the muddy water as Johnson scrambled to regain his balance. Blackwood returned fire immediately, bullets thudding into the shed's wooden walls. Mason ducked back inside, grabbing Joe's arm. "Now!" Through the back window. The rear of the shed featured a smaller window that opened onto the sloping hillside behind the property. Under normal circumstances, it would be a 15-foot drop to the ground, but the floodwaters had risen to within 5 feet of the opening, creating a dangerous but viable escape route. Mason helped Joe position himself on the windowsill. "It's going to hurt," he warned, eyeing the old man's wounded shoulder. "Been hurting since 1982, Joe replied with a grim smile. "What's a little more?" With that, he pushed off, dropping feet first into the floodwater below. Mason quickly lowered Hope to him, the fawn bleating in protest but remaining relatively calm in the old ranger's arms. "Your turn," Mason told Duke. But the shepherd hesitated, ears perked toward the ladder. A moment later, Mason heard it too. Boots on the rungs. "Go," Mason urged, pointing to the window. Duke whined but obeyed, leaping gracefully into the water below. Mason raised his pistol just as Johnson's head appeared at the top of the ladder. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second before Mason fired, the bullet striking the wooden rung inches from Johnson's hand. The man ducked back down with a curse. Taking advantage of the momentary reprieve, Mason swung himself out the window, hanging briefly by his fingertips before dropping into the flood below. The impact sent waves of agony through his infected leg, nearly causing him to black out. The cold water shocked him back to consciousness as the current immediately tried to sweep him away. Strong jaws clamped gently but firmly around his wrist. Duke, swimming strongly against the current, pulled Mason toward the hillside where Joe waited with Hope, both partially sheltered beneath a rocky overhang. As Mason dragged himself from the water, a barrage of gunfire erupted from the shed. Blackwood had reached the upper level and was firing blindly in their direction, bullets kicking up spray from the floodwater. "Keep moving," Mason gasped, pushing Joe ahead of him up the slope. "We need to reach the ridge." The hillside offered some cover, but they were exposed and moving slowly. Joe's strength was flagging, his face ashen from blood loss. Mason took Hope from him, cradling the fawn in one arm while supporting Joe with the other. Duke led the way, finding the safest path through the underbrush. Behind them, Blackwood's voice rose above the storm, promising retribution. More gunfire followed, bullets whining overhead or thudding into trees around them. Mason pushed Joe down behind a fallen log as splinters exploded from the bark near their heads. "I can't keep up," Joe panted, his breathing labored. "Take Hope and Duke and go. I'll hold them off." "Not happening," Mason replied firmly. "We all make it, or none of us do." The old ranger managed a weak smile. "Stubborn as a Tennessee mule." "Learned from the best," Mason returned, checking his ammunition. 3 rounds left. The sound of splashing announced Blackwood's pursuit. The developer had abandoned the flooded shed and was wading through waist-deep water at the base of the hill, rifle held above his head to keep it dry. "One chance," Mason murmured, sighting down his pistol. But before he could fire, a deep rumbling drowned out even the roar of the flood. The ground beneath them trembled. Mason looked up to see a section of the hillside above them give way, saturated earth no longer able to hold against gravity's pull. "Landslide," he shouted, grabbing Joe and pulling him deeper into the cover of the fallen log. The wave of mud and debris swept down the slope, gathering speed as it went, Trees snapped like matchsticks in its path. Mason held Hope tight against his chest. Duke pressed against his side, as they watched in horror as the landslide engulfed Blackwood in its unstoppable flow. The developer's scream cut off abruptly as he disappeared beneath tons of mud and broken trees, carried away into the flood below. In seconds, the hillside was transformed, the path they had climbed erased by nature's fury. Silence fell, broken only by the continued patter of rain and the distant roar of floodwaters. Mason checked on Joe, alarmed to find the old ranger unresponsive, his skin cool and clammy to the touch. "Joe," Mason called, patting the man's cheek. "Stay with me." Joe's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and distant. "Cold," he murmured. "Getting real cold." Shock and blood loss a deadly combination. Mason looked around desperately for help that wasn't coming, for a solution that didn't exist. They were cut off, with no communication and no way to navigate the transformed landscape safely. Duke whined softly, nosing Joe's limp hand before looking up at Mason with an expression that seemed to carry a terrible understanding. Hope stirred in Mason's arms, pressing her small head against his chest as if offering comfort. "Hold on, Joe," Mason said, his voice breaking. "Just hold on." But as the rain continued to fall and darkness gathered around them, Mason feared he was witnessing the end of something irreplaceable, a good man's life, sacrificed to save a creature many would consider insignificant. And for what? A development would still be built, the wildlife would still be driven away, the world would continue turning, indifferent to their struggle. For the first time since leaving the military, Mason felt the crushing weight of futility pressing down on him, heavier than the mud that had swept away their pursuer. Duke's sudden alert posture snapped Mason from his dark thoughts. The shepherd's ears were pricked forward, head tilted in the attitude of intense listening. A moment later, Mason heard it too, the distinctive whoomp-whoomp of helicopter rotors, growing louder by the second. Hope or hallucination. Mason wasn't sure which was crueler. The helicopter materialized through the curtain of rain, its searchlight cutting a stark white path through the gathering darkness. Mason stared upward, disbelief warring with desperate hope as the aircraft hovered over the devastated landscape. It was a rescue chopper, the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency logo visible on its underside. Duke barked sharply, abandoning his usual discipline in the face of potential salvation. Mason fumbled with his belt, removing it to wave above his head, the metal buckle catching the searchlight's beam. The helicopter banked slightly, the light centering on their position before holding steady. "They see us," Mason told Joe, but the old ranger didn't respond, his breathing shallow and irregular. The helicopter couldn't land. There was no suitable clearing on the unstable hillside. Instead, a figure rappelled from the open door, descending through the rain with practiced efficiency. As the rescuer touched down 20 yards away, Mason recognized the uniform of a wildlife officer. "Over here!" Mason shouted, his voice cracking with exhaustion. The officer navigated the treacherous slope, carrying a medical kit and what looked like communication equipment. As he drew closer, Mason could make out a weathered face beneath the helmet. A man in his 40s with the confident movements of someone accustomed to wilderness rescues. "Mason Fletcher," the officer called above the noise of the hovering helicopter. Mason nodded, too stunned to question how the man knew his name. Officer Daniel Reeves, TWRA. The man introduced himself, kneeling immediately to check Joe's condition. Your friend called it in before the phone lines went down. Said you had poachers on your property and needed immediate assistance. Old Joe called you? Mason asked, watching as Reeves efficiently applied pressure bandages to the ranger's wounded shoulder. Got through to our dispatcher about 2 hours ago. Said Harlan Blackwood was hunting illegally and threatening a resident. Reeves worked as he spoke, taking Joe's vitals with quick, practiced movements. We've been trying to build a case against Blackwood for months. The storm actually helped us get here faster. We were already airborne for flood evacuations. Hope shifted in Mason's arms, drawing the officer's attention for the first time. His eyebrows rose at the sight of the fawn, then higher still as he noticed Duke sitting protectively beside them. That's her, isn't it? Reeves asked. The evidence Joe mentioned. Her mother was shot by Blackwood's men, Mason confirmed. They were clearing wildlife from the preserve to help his development project. Reeves nodded grimly. We suspected as much. The governor's office has been pressuring our department to approve the environmental impact statements for that resort. He finished stabilizing Joe and keyed his radio. I need immediate extraction for an elderly male. Gunshot wound to the shoulder, significant blood loss. Also have a male with leg injury, a dog, and, he glanced at Hope, wildlife evidence. The helicopter dropped a rescue basket. Together, Mason and Reeves secured Joe inside it, the old ranger briefly regaining consciousness as they worked. Did we get him? Joe mumbled, his eyes unfocused. We got him, Mason assured him, gripping his hand. You held on long enough, just like I asked. Joe's lips curved in a faint smile before his eyes fluttered closed again. They watched as the basket was carefully raised to the waiting helicopter. Your turn, Reeves said, turning to Mason. Can you climb with assistance? Mason looked down at his leg, the bandage now soaked through with a mixture of blood and river water. The infection had progressed, leaving the limb swollen and nearly useless. He shook his head. Not without help. What about the dog and the fawn? Duke can climb anything. The fawn? Mason hesitated, looking down at Hope, who had fallen into an exhausted sleep in his arms. I don't know how we'll get her up. Reeves considered for a moment, then keyed his radio again. After a brief exchange, a specialized harness was lowered from the helicopter. It's designed for injured search dogs, Reeves explained, helping Mason secure Hope into the contraption. The fawn startled awake during the process but calmed when Duke pressed against her, licking her face reassuringly. Once Hope was secured, Reeves signaled, and the harness was carefully raised. Mason watched anxiously as the fawn was lifted, swinging slightly in the wind but otherwise unharmed. When she reached the door, gentle hands received her, and she disappeared into the helicopter's interior. Now the dog, Reeves said. But Duke had other ideas. The German shepherd backed away from the harness, standing firmly beside Mason. He won't go without me, Mason explained, a lump forming in his throat at the dog's loyalty. Then you'll go together, Reeves decided, adjusting the harness to accommodate both man and dog. It was unorthodox, but workable, given Duke's training and Mason's condition. Secured together. Mason and Duke were lifted from the hillside, spinning slowly as they ascended toward the helicopter. Duke remained perfectly calm, his body pressed against Mason's side, eyes alert but untroubled by the unusual mode of transportation. As they were pulled into the helicopter's cabin, Mason immediately looked for Hope and Joe. The old ranger was being tended by a flight medic. Oxygen mask covering his face, but his chest rising and falling steadily. Hope had been placed in a special transport crate, lined with blankets and secured for the flight. "She's fine," a female voice assured him as hands helped unfasten the harness. "Remarkable little thing. Most wild fawns would be in shock by now." Mason turned to find a woman in a TWRA uniform examining his injured leg. Her name tag read, Dr. Elaine Winters, wildlife veterinarian. "The mother?" Mason asked as the helicopter banked away from the hillside, heading for clearer skies. "That's the even more remarkable part," Dr. Winters said, cleaning his wound with practiced efficiency. "We found her about a mile downstream from your property, bullet wound to the flank, exhausted, but alive. She's already at our rehabilitation facility." The news hit Mason like a physical force. The doe had survived. All of this, the danger, the flood, the confrontation with Blackwood hadn't been in vain. "Blackwood?" he asked, wincing as Dr. Winters applied antiseptic to his infected leg. "No sign of him or his men," Officer Reeves replied, securing his rappelling equipment. "But with your testimony and Joe's, plus the evidence from the fawn and doe, we have enough to shut down his operation permanently." As the helicopter gained altitude, Mason could see the full extent of the flooding. His cabin stood partially submerged. The shed where they'd made their last stand barely visible above the water. The hillside bore a massive scar where the landslide had carved a new path to the valley below. It was a landscape transformed, yet somehow purified by the destructive force of nature. "We'll need to get you both to the hospital," Dr. Winters told him, finishing the temporary dressing on his leg. "This infection is serious." Mason nodded absently, his attention focused on Duke, who had moved to sit beside Hope's crate. The shepherd's nose was pressed against the mesh door, his tail wagging gently as the fawn responded with a soft bleat. "That dog saved her life, didn't he?" Dr. Winters asked, following Mason's gaze. "He saved all our lives," Mason corrected. "More than once." The flight to Johnson City Medical Center took 20 minutes. The helicopter setting down on the hospital's rooftop landing pad where medical teams waited with gurneys. Joe was rushed inside first, his condition critical but stable according to the flight medic. Mason followed, insisting on walking with assistance rather than being wheeled in. Duke at his side wearing a hastily applied service dog vest provided by Officer Reeves. "What about Hope?" Mason asked as they entered the elevator. "She's coming too," Dr. Winters assured him, carrying the transport crate herself. "I have privileges at the hospital's veterinary annex. I'll examine her there while you're being treated." The next several hours passed in a blur of medical procedures and questions. Mason's leg wound required surgical debridement and powerful antibiotics to combat the infection that had spread dangerously through his system. Throughout it all, Duke remained nearby, granted special permission due to Reeves's intervention and his own impeccable behavior. When Mason finally awoke in a private room, the first light of dawn was filtering through the window blinds. Duke lay on a blanket beside the bed, raising his head immediately when Mason stirred. "Morning, boy," Mason murmured, reaching down to scratch the shepherd's ears. A light knock at the door preceded Officer Reeves's entrance. The wildlife officer looked fresher than the previous night, though fatigue lines still marked his face. "How are you feeling?" Reeves asked, pulling a chair beside the bed. "Like I lost a fight with a river," Mason replied. "How's Joe?" "Stable. They took him into surgery last night to repair the damage to his shoulder. Doctors say he's tough as old leather, should make a full recovery." Relief washed over Mason. And hope. "That's partly why I'm here," Reeves said, leaning forward. "Dr. Winters says she's doing remarkably well. The wound was superficial, and she's already eating on her own. When can she be reunited with her mother?" "That's the complicated part." Reeves hesitated. "The doe is recovering, but Dr. Winters is concerned about something she observed with the fawn." Mason tensed, preparing for bad news. "What is it?" "The fawn has imprinted not on humans, as we feared might happen, but on your dog." Reeves nodded toward Duke, who was listening to the conversation with pricked ears. "It's unprecedented in our experience. She follows him, takes cues from him, even sleeps curled against him if given the opportunity." "Is that a problem?" "It's unusual. Dr. Winters isn't sure how the fawn will readjust to life with her mother after forming such a strong bond with Duke. And there's something else." Reeves reached into his pocket and withdrew a small evidence bag containing what looked like a metal tag. "We found this embedded in the doe's ear. It's a research tag from the University of Tennessee's wildlife program, but it's not recent. According to their records, this doe was part of a rehabilitation project 8 years ago." "What kind of project?" "She was orphaned as a fawn herself, raised with the assistance of a trained dog handler and his animal, a technique the university was exploring for wildlife rehabilitation." Reeves paused, his expression thoughtful. "The handler's name was Thompson. Joseph Thompson." The revelation struck Mason like a physical blow. "Joe raised Hope's mother." Reeves nodded. "According to the records." "Yes. After she was successfully released, Joe retired from the program and became a forest ranger. The university discontinued the project due to funding cuts. Does Joe know?" "We haven't told him yet. He's still recovering from surgery." Reeves leaned back in his chair. "But there's more. When we ran a background check on Blackwood's operation, we discovered something interesting about one of his associates, the man who escaped during the flood." "Johnson," Mason supplied. "Yes. His full name is Eric Johnson. According to our records, he used to work as a trainer for hunting dogs before joining Blackwood's security team." Reeves fixed Mason with a significant look. "One of the dogs he trained was a German Shepherd that later was sold to the military for their K9 program. The description matches Duke perfectly." Mason looked down at Duke, who met his gaze with the calm intelligence that had drawn Mason to him from the beginning. Duke was trained to hunt deer. Initially, yes, but his temperament made him better suited for rescue work, which is why the military program accepted him. Reeves smiled slightly. "Ironic, isn't it? A dog bred to hunt deer risks his life to save one instead." The pieces were falling into place, forming a pattern that seemed too perfect to be coincidental. Joe, the doe, Duke, and now Hope, all connected by invisible threads stretching back years before they came together in this moment. "What happens now?" Mason asked, reaching down to stroke Duke's head. "That's why I'm here," Reeves replied. "We need to discuss what comes next for all of you." 3 months later, Mason stood on the newly rebuilt porch of his cabin. watching the summer sunset paint the Tennessee Valley in hues of gold and amber. The floodwaters had long since receded, leaving behind a landscape transformed but resilient. Much like himself, Mason reflected. His leg had healed well, though the doctors warned he might always have a slight limp, a small price to pay. Duke lay at his feet, the shepherd's coat gleaming with health in the evening light. From the guest cabin 50 yards away, smoke curled from the chimney where old Joe had taken up permanent residence after his release from the hospital. "Beautiful evening," Joe observed, making his way up the path with the aid of a carved hickory cane. His wounded shoulder had healed slower than expected, restricting some movement, but the old ranger refused to let it limit his activities. "Best kind," Mason agreed, pulling an extra chair forward. "Coffee's still hot." Joe settled into the chair with a satisfied grunt, accepting the mug Mason offered. They sat in companionable silence, watching the light change over the valley that had nearly claimed their lives. The weeks following the flood had brought unexpected developments. Harlan Blackwood's body had been recovered 5 miles downstream, along with those of 2 of his men. The subsequent investigation had uncovered a web of corruption that stretched from local officials to state environmental offices, all facilitated by Blackwood's money and influence. "Heard from Reeves today?" Mason mentioned, sipping his coffee. "The governor signed the bill expanding the wildlife preserve. Includes all of Blackwood's former property." Joe nodded with satisfaction. "Sometimes the good Lord works in mysterious ways. Sometimes he's as subtle as a flash flood." The legal aftermath had transformed Mason's quiet existence. His testimony before the grand jury had been pivotal in exposing the corruption, thrusting him reluctantly into the local spotlight. The story of Duke's rescue of Hope had captured public imagination, spreading from local news to national networks. Donations had poured in, not just for Mason's cabin reconstruction, but for the expansion of the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center where Hope's mother was recovering. "You going to that town meeting tomorrow?" Joe asked, his weathered face giving nothing away. Mason sighed. "Suppose I should. They want me to speak against the resort development company that bought out Blackwood's assets." "Funny how life turns," Joe mused. 8 years running from people. Now they can't get enough of your opinions." It was true. Mason had become, much to his discomfort, something of a local celebrity and reluctant conservationist. The man who once couldn't bear human company now found himself regularly addressing community groups about wildlife protection and ethical development. Duke's ears suddenly perked up, his body tensing with alert attention. Both men followed his gaze to the tree line at the edge of the property where the shadows had deepened with the approaching dusk. "Right on time," Joe murmured. From the darkness of the forest, a doe emerged cautiously into the clearing. Her movements were graceful but watchful, eyes scanning for potential threats. The healed bullet wound on her flank was barely visible now, just a slight irregularity in her summer coat. Behind her came a smaller form, Hope. No longer the trembling fawn they had rescued, but a growing yearling, her spotted coat giving way to the uniform brown of adolescence. But they weren't alone. 2 smaller fawns, this year's offspring, skipped behind Hope, their spots vivid against their tawny coats. The doe had not only survived, but thrived, producing twins the following season. Duke rose to his feet, tail wagging gently. but remained on the porch as trained. This was their nightly ritual. The deer family would emerge from the forest at dusk, grazing in Mason's meadow while Duke watched over them from a respectful distance. "Still amazes me," Mason said softly. "Wild animals shouldn't trust us like this." "Not us, they trust," Joe corrected, nodding toward Duke. "Him. Always has been." The reunion of Hope with her mother had been a careful, monitored process at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. Dr. Winters had been concerned that the fawn's unusual bond with Duke would prevent normal reintegration, but something unexpected had occurred. The doe, upon seeing Duke, had shown no fear instead. She'd approached the shepherd with what could only be described as recognition. "It's because of your work with her mother," Dr. Winters had explained to Joe. "She associates dogs with safety rather than threat. It's extraordinary she's passed that learned behavior to her offspring." The experiment that Joe had participated in years earlier had created an unexpected legacy, a deer that taught her fawn to trust rather than fear their natural predator. When Mason had brought Duke to the rehabilitation center, the shepherd's gentle nature had reawakened that trust, creating a bridge between species that defied conventional wildlife behavior. Now, Hope approached the porch steps with confidence, stopping just short of the bottom stair. Duke descended slowly, movements deliberate and non-threatening, to meet her. The yearling deer touched noses with the shepherd in a greeting that never failed to move Mason, no matter how many times he witnessed it. "Some folks at the Wildlife Department still can't believe it," Joe commented. "Got researchers from 3 universities wanting to study them." "They can study from a distance," Mason replied firmly. The protective instinct that had awakened during those desperate days of the flood had only strengthened with time, extending beyond Duke to encompass Hope and her family. The doe and her new fawns remained at the meadow's edge, grazing peacefully, while Hope and Duke engaged in their nightly ritual. The shepherd would lie down in the grass, and the yearling would graze around him, occasionally touching his head with her nose or standing guard while he dozed. "You know," Joe said thoughtfully, "when I was working that rehabilitation program years back, we had a theory. Animals that experience trauma together form bonds that transcend their natural instincts. Survival trumps instinct every time." Mason nodded. He'd seen it in war men from completely different backgrounds becoming closer than brothers after surviving combat together. "Why would animals be any different?" "Duke saved her life," Mason observed. "She remembers. And she's teaching her siblings the same trust," Joe added. "Changing the natural order, one generation at a time." As darkness settled over the valley, Mason flicked on the porch lights. This was usually when the deer family would retreat to the forest for the night, Duke returning to the porch with reluctance. But tonight, something was different. Hope lingered, approaching the steps again and making a soft, nickering sound. Duke looked back at Mason, a question in his intelligent eyes. "Go ahead," Mason said softly. The shepherd descended the steps and followed Hope toward the tree line, stopping at the edge of the light's reach. The yearling deer seemed to be inviting him further, taking a few steps into the forest before looking back. "He won't go," Joe predicted, "too well trained to leave the property." But Duke surprised them both. After a moment's hesitation, the shepherd followed Hope into the trees, disappearing from Mason half rose from his chair, concern flickering across his face. "He'll be back," Joe assured him. "Some things a man's got to trust." They waited in silence, Mason fighting the urge to call for Duke. 20 minutes passed before they heard the rustle of underbrush. Duke emerged from the forest, trotting confidently back to the porch. But he wasn't alone. Hope followed at a distance, and behind her, cautiously, came her mother and the 2 fawns. The doe stopped at the edge of the yard, clearly at the limit of her comfort zone. But the fawns, emboldened by their sister's example, skipped forward a few more steps before their mother's warning snort halted them. Duke climbed the porch steps and settled at Mason's feet with a contented sigh, as if to say, "Mission accomplished." "Well, I'll be," Joe breathed. "She's introducing the family." It was a small moment, perhaps insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but to Mason it represented something profound, a bridge between worlds that most believed could never connect, a reminder that healing was possible, that bonds formed in crisis could transform into something lasting and meaningful. "You know," Joe said, breaking the contemplative silence, "when I called the wildlife service that day, I wasn't sure we'd make it. Figured at least the evidence would be found with our bodies." He smiled, the lines in his weathered face deepening. "Never expected we'd end up here. With all this." Mason understood all this encompassed more than the rebuilt cabin or the dear family at the edge of his yard. It meant the community that had embraced them, the purpose they'd found in protecting the land, the healing that had begun when a dog risked everything to save a drowning fawn. "Life has a way of surprising you," Mason replied, the words feeling insufficient for the depth of his gratitude. "That it does, son," Joe agreed, raising his coffee mug in a small toast. "That it surely does." As darkness settled completely over the valley, the deer family retreated into the forest, melting away like shadows. Duke watched them go, his duty for the night complete. Tomorrow they would return, and the night after that a new pattern established, a new normal created from the chaos of disaster. Mason leaned back in his chair, feeling a peace he hadn't known since before the war. His nightmares had diminished, replaced by dreams of flowing water that carried him not toward danger, but toward home. The river that had nearly claimed them had also, in its way, saved them, washing away the past and clearing a path for something new to grow. "Think I will go to that town meeting tomorrow," Mason decided, the words surprising him as much as Joe. The old ranger smiled knowingly. "Figured you might. Some things a man can't run from forever." "Like responsibility?" Mason asked, thinking of the conservation group that had asked him to lead their local chapter. "Like purpose," Joe corrected. "The good Lord didn't pull you out of that flood just so you could keep sitting on this porch watching the world go by." As if in agreement, Duke rested his head on Mason's knee, amber eyes reflecting the porch light with a wisdom that transcended species. In that moment, Mason understood that the miracle wasn't just that they had survived, but that they had found a way to live again, truly live, with purpose and connection. "No," Mason agreed, resting his hand on Duke's head. "I suppose he didn't." the night wrapped around them like a blanket, peaceful and full of promise. In the distance, an owl called, and somewhere in the protected forest, a deer family bedded down in safety. All was as it should be, broken pieces mended, new connections formed, a small corner of the world set right again, right. And it had all begun with a dog who risked his life to save a drowning deer. In the quiet hills of Tennessee, where rivers carve stories into the land, we discovered a truth worth remembering. It's never too late to find your purpose. Mason Fletcher thought his life's meaningful chapters had ended after the war, until a German shepherd named Duke showed him otherwise by saving a drowning fawn. Sometimes, friends, our greatest acts of courage come when we're broken, when we've convinced ourselves our best days are behind us. Mason and Old Joe weren't looking to become heroes or conservationists. They were just two wounded souls trying to survive another day. But in protecting something vulnerable, they found strength they'd forgotten they possessed. Many of us reach our 50s and 60s believing our impact stories are written, our contributions cataloged and complete. Mason's journey reminds